In the introduction to the book, you write about your parents, both Holocaust survivors, who after the war made their way to Rome, where you were born, and eventually they migrated with you to Israel, but with no great enthusiasm for the Zionist project. So to start with, could you talk a little bit about their relationship to Zionism and to Israel, and how they eventually arrived at a kind of accommodation with the settler colonial project, despite having shunned Zionism before arriving in Palestine?
Sure. Actually, it's a very good timing for speaking about it for me, because I'm just completing a novel about that period, which is not exactly autobiographical, but is based on the early 50s in Palestine and my experiences and other people's experiences. So this will be, of course, at the heart of the novel. Now, my parents were, in a sense, more typical than other members of their families. For example, my mother had a brother and a sister that in the 30s have left as Zionists, have left to Palestine and stayed there, and actually didn't have much contact with the family after arriving in Palestine. Very minimal contact. My father had two brothers who were communists. So the two families were kind of like the two polarities of the Jewish population in Palestine. Those two groups of the communists and the Zionists were very small. Most of Polish Jews were supporters of the Bund, which was a socialist revolutionary organization set up in Russia, but also in existence in Poland, and it was the biggest Jewish party in the Polish parliament, and indeed the third biggest party in the parliament. So this was a very large organization, and my parents were supporting it. So the Bund was a cultural organization of Jews, socialist, revolutionary, and supporting the workers. So in that sense, my parents were more typical of the Jews of Poland, but not at all typical of the two families. They had no plans to go anywhere. They were Poles, Jewish Poles, that, but for Nazism, would have been there until today. When the war started, of course, they were incarcerated in the ghetto in the town that they both lived. They both come from the same town, and they're actually first cousins. My father was married to another woman who in 1943 was taken to Treblinka together with his mother and sisters and killed there. So this was his first wife. They both lived in the ghetto and worked in the ghetto, and because they were young and strong, they survived until they were taken to Auschwitz. And they survived Auschwitz for almost a year, which is very unusual. But when the Nazis vacated Auschwitz after 15th of January 1945, they were both taken on what is called a Fußmarsch, which is a death march. And my mother ended up in Bergen-Belsen. Again, amazingly, she walked all the way there, and I just still can't understand this. And my father walked all the way to Austria, to Mauthausen, and then ended up in a sub-camp of Mauthausen, which the Nazis called the Hell of Hells, because it was the worst camp to be in. And that camp was Gusen too, where people were used as human mules in huge, very long and narrow tunnels in the mountain above Mauthausen, where they built the V2 at the end of the war. So they were human mules, and there is a picture of my father in the Holocaust Museum in Washington, but also in the Mauthausen Museum. As you enter the museum, we didn't know this until we visited, you know. As you walk into the museum, he is in a, you know, the center of a picture of 4 inmates on the Liberation Day eating some food that the Americans gave them. Of course, they don't have a stitch on. They're totally naked, and they look like, you know, Muslim. Yeah, they were basically walking skeletons. So both my parents have survived despite and against the odds, and ended up in Torino. My mother, who knew that my father survived from the Red Cross lists, searched for him all over Europe without a penny in her pocket. Of course, she was, you know, an inmate that was freed by the British, and she found him in Torino, and they got married. And they didn't want to go to Palestine. You know, at the time, Palestine was the only place that was possible to go to, illegally, of course, because the British wouldn't give them certificates. But they wouldn't go, and they tried to leave to the United States and other places. But of course, no other country was actually so nice as to offer those, they were called displaced persons, the visas to enter. So in 1948, when it was still the only place they could go to, but now legally, they've decided to go. And I was born in 1946, so I was 2 years old. And on the boat, there was arms training. My father refused to partake. He said he will not fight anyone, will not kill anyone, and didn't want to be killed either, and he's not going to use arms. He was arrested on arrival into Haifa and was kept, and there was no legal standing for conscientious objectors. Yeah. It didn't exist as a concept, as a legal department, etc. You couldn't do it.
It's remarkable, isn't it, in that when people think about draft resistors in Israel, I think the earliest point people tend to think back to is the first Lebanon War, I suppose.
No, actually, there were draft resistors very famously, you know, in the 60s, you know, Giora Neumann and people like that, you know. But actually, he may have been the first, if not the second or the third. I don't think that more than a handful existed in 1948. So he was put in jail, and he was due to be in jail for 3 years. And then the judge, when he was brought the second time before a judge in a court-martial, said to him, listen, you can be drafted without fighting, you can be a medic, and you won't have to carry a gun. Mind you, there were not enough guns for the fighters, so, you know. So my father, in the end, broke down, if you want, and agreed to not carry a gun and be a medic, and he was in famous battles in Latrun. Somehow he survived. So you can see that their entry into Palestine or Israel was not welcome in the way that the mythology tells us. While he was in jail, by the way, my mother and I, as a baby, were also in jail, in the biggest British jail that was turned into an entry camp. So these people that spent 6 years in camps ended up in camps in Israel, and indeed more than 1 million people ended up in camps in Israel that they could not leave because the camps were locked and kept by the army for years. And some of them lived in camps for more than 10 years. So the whole concept of camps in Israel is very, very loaded. So I think this is the background that you're asking about. Now, how did they turn to support Zionism. I think basically Zionism is a very powerful both material and ideological system, which is very powerful. And after some years, they've started forgetting things that happened before, and more became part of, individuals are not capable of fighting a system like this unless they are totally committed and politicized and have an organization behind them, and friends to support them. They were not political. My father's refusal to serve was more humanistic than politicized. He never joined the Communist Party, though his brother was in the Communist Party in Israel all his life. So in the end, in 1967, when I was fighting as an officer in the Golan Heights, and I came for a furlough, totally devastated and totally against the war, they wanted me to come with them to Jerusalem, to the liberated Wailing Wall, as they called it, and I refused because I thought this was a nationalistic symbol, and I didn't want to partake in this kind of ritualistic dancing, So we changed positions. My father, who refused to fight, now joined the crowd around the golden calf, if you want.
You point out in the book that Israeli military operations, public support for them is unusually high as compared to wars fought by other states. It'll be sort of over 90% of the population supporting the Operation Cast Lead or something like this. And I suppose if one chooses to not go along with the ideology of the State of Israel and the militarism, one is really choosing to be a pariah in a way that is not the same, say, if one opposes a war in the United States, for instance.
Of course. I mean, the wars in Israel are always presented as existential wars. None of them actually was existential apart from 1973 to a degree. But none of the wars, including 1948, were not really existential, because the power of the IDF, ever since it was set up in 1948 on the basis of the older organizations, was such that even the combined forces of the Arab armies were never had a chance against it, as I describe in the book and as historians have pointed out. So in a sense, in Israel, unlike other countries, you are a pariah and an outcast if you are not supporting any action, that the IDF is taking. And I think the level of support is basically unheard of in other countries. So this has been the history since 1948, or even before the IDF became called that, the Haganah and the other organization. The support of military activity is really very high, because we're talking about a settler colonial state or a settler colonial society before the state is set up. And you can think about the American Revolution and the support that action against the Amerindians had in North America, which was very, very high, of course, because it was always seen and presented as an existential question.
I imagine that a supporter of Israel might say something about although obviously, as you say, Israel has a very powerful military, it's a small country, it lacks strategic depth, you can't really sort of retreat into the country, you can't really fight a sort of defensive battle, and this is how the IDF's preference for offensive operations is defended. So what do you make of that argument? Because it's sometimes sort of said, if Israel loses a war, there won't be another war to fight because it will be defeated comprehensively.
Well, first of all, the idea of strategic depth really doesn't exist nowadays, because the war is not really fought in the way that it was fought in the 19th or even mid-20th century. We're talking about technological wars, we're talking about wars at great distance, before anything starts to move. Yeah, so that's the first thing. The second thing is basically in a settler colonial society, everything is presented as existential with good reason.
Conflict is permanent.
Yeah, conflict is basically innate in such a society. So it's nothing to do with the depth or otherwise. When Israel controlled all the territories that it did after 1967, it behaved in the way that we now know very well. It attacked right, left, and center beyond those territories as well. So it attacked in Egypt, it attacked in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq. It attacked in Libya, in Tunisia, and in Africa, in Eastern Africa, as you know. So it wasn't a question ever of a strategic depth or territory. It was a question of holding on to more and more territory and trying to get even further. And this is obviously true since Herzl. I mean, Herzl wanted the whole of Palestine, and he wanted it without the population. Of course, he didn't write this openly, as you know, but he, in his diary, describes how he will so-called transfer the population to the countries surrounding Palestine. So this is not a new idea, and it's not to do with the existential threat to Israel, but it is to do with the holding on to the territory. And to hold on to the territory in the best and safest way, you have to expel every one of the indigenous population. Now, if expulsion doesn't work, which of course it didn't in the northern United States, then you use extermination. And sometimes in most of those societies you use a combination of both. It starts with expulsion, say in South Africa, into the Bantustans. And if it doesn't work, and the black population revolts in the center of towns, then you use exterminatory measures. So this is a scaled response to what is really an existential threat, and that is the threat of the indigenous population to hold on to the areas they live in.
Just going back to your parents and their experience of migrating to Palestine, I would imagine that most people would assume that people who moved to the region after the Second World War, or even previously as well, that they did so with a great deal of enthusiasm. And as you say, in the case of your parents, Israel was the only option. There were no other options, which is obviously kind of ironic when we think about the mythology of the Second World War, because one could think today that the Western Allies fought the war on behalf of the Jewish people, almost, the extent to which the Holocaust is centred in media these days. But do you think, although clearly your father was unusual as a draft resistor, do you think that lack of enthusiasm was the case for a pretty large sector of the population initially?
Yeah, I mean, here we come to a very successfully silenced part of Israeli history, and that is the oppression of the incomers from 1945. There were two large groups that came into Israel after to Palestine in 1945 and to Israel in 1948. About 300,000 of Holocaust survivors. Let us consider them. Sometimes they're called Ashkenazis. I think historians which I find more objective call them the Yiddish people, because Yiddish was their language and their culture. And they were the people from basically Eastern Europe in the main. And of course, they come from the Eastern Europe, but they are called Western. And this is how ideology works in Israel. And
so
people
North African Jews are Western, bizarrely.
Exactly. They come from West, but they are Eastern, Mizrahis. So this is how the power of ideology can easily come up with these inventions, and they exist to our day. Those two groups, more than 1 million of people from North Africa and a smaller number from Iraq, Syria, small numbers from Iran and Turkey, but mainly from North Africa, as you said. They come in unwillingly, in the sense that, for example, in Iraq, the oldest diaspora in existence, 2,500 years old, they had no intention of going to Israel, and the Israelis realized that and actually initiate a series of bombings in synagogues in Basra and in Baghdad by the Mossad. The people who throw the bombs are caught red-handed, as they were later on in Cairo. And they used leaflets blaming, supposedly they were communists and nationalists. But the people were caught and brought to justice. But this episode drives the Iraqi population to leave to Israel. The Iraqi government asks them not to leave, by the way. They are really asking them not to leave because they don't want them to feel pushed out, because this is the middle class, by the way, of this Arab society. And the same, not the same, a similar situation exists in North Africa, where Zionist propagators are, in a sense, fueling anti-Semitism by saying the Jews are not proper citizens of this country and they should leave. And in a sense, a situation is built that panic drives those people, mainly from Morocco, but also from Algeria and Tunisia, very few from Egypt, out of their countries that they have been in for so long that we don't even know the beginning of Jewish habitations in those countries. And basically, a lot of people, the middle class, goes to France, because French was their language, and they had, as opposed to the Muslims, they had the right to go to France. So, the French were playing the Jews against the Muslims, like any colonial regime. And the Jews had the right to go to France, and those that could afford to went to Paris or to southern France. Those that didn't have any funds or any education to support them ended up in Israel. And when they arrived to Israel, they ended up in decrepit, horrible conditions in the transit camps. And as I said, some of them spent more than a decade in those camps. They couldn't work. They were kept by soldiers so that they couldn't leave the camps. The Israeli television just produced 2 years ago 20 episodes about those camps. What came out, the few historians knew this, and those that read the books knew it, but the population was quite shocked by the discovery of what happened to the European survivors and the North African incoming population. And those two populations were treated with not just disdain, but hostility. And I don't want to go on about this, but I'll just explain some elements of this hostility. Arabic and Yiddish were languages not to be spoken. So I, as a child, would say to my parents on the bus, please speak Hebrew, do not speak Yiddish. I was not in any way special. All the children of refugees that came to Israel after 1945 were basically tutored at school to say to their parents, only speak Hebrew. Now, none of these people spoke Hebrew in their daily life, neither in Morocco, nor in Poland, or in Russia, or in Romania, etc. I mean, they didn't speak Hebrew. They prayed in Hebrew, but they didn't know the language as a language in daily life. For example, it was not legal to produce theater in Yiddish. Can you imagine that? That in a state calling itself the state of the Jewish people, the language is called Jewish. I mean, Yiddish means Jewish. Yeah, you know that. The language of Jews, of most Jews in the world before the Holocaust, was illegal to produce. Now, not only that, Ben Gurion was so hostile to Yiddish that he put a special tax on paper if it was to be used in Yiddish newspapers or books. That was the only language which had this special tax to silence the cultural production in Yiddish. In my novel, there is a chapter about a child who is taken to the theater during the day because the theater is illegal, and has to run out with his father and mother when the police invade the theater in the middle of Hamlet.
That brings me on to my next question, really, because as well as you described the suppression of Yiddish and other languages, you talk in the book about the way in which Zionism was really a generalised repudiation of the life of the Jewish diaspora before World War II, and a determination to create this very homogenous and martial culture that was very alien to Jewish life before the founding of the State of Israel. So could you talk about some of the other ways in which Zionism was hostile to, ashamed of, and even repulsed by much of the culture of the pre-war European diaspora?
Well, you can see that Zionism had to be very drastic in re-editing Jewish history. Because for 3,000 years, the Jews were not a military power, with very small exceptions, insignificant exceptions. For example, the fight against the Romans never stood a chance. And indeed, it was defeated twice within 100 years with terrible results for Jewish life and Jewish culture. So those exceptions, like the famous Masada and the fall of Jerusalem, what is so beautifully and sadly described by Flavius Josephus, these martial episodes in Jewish life were total failures. The book of Joshua describes the destruction of, in 26 chapters, the total destruction, supposed destruction, of 11 national communities in Palestine, and this is the myth that Israel was built on. In other words, you come, you burn, you kill, you destroy not just people, but animals, the stocks, the houses. In other words, this is an extermination which the Bible not only suggests, but actually it's not a recommendation, you have to do it. Okay? And this is the story of the book of Joshua. Now, we know today, because archaeologists have proven, that none of this has actually happened. Now, that in a sense is good news. But the bad news is that Zionists believe that it happened exactly like it's described in the Bible, because that's what they want to believe. That is the myth that is useful for them. In other words, in order to get the Palestinians out of Palestine, and most of them were expelled from Palestine in 1948 and later, they needed a myth of the kind of the book of Joshua. Now, I don't know of another myth which is actually universally read and so on, which is so genocidal as the book of Joshua. So, first of all, what the Zionist movement has done is edited the Jewish history to include only those martial parts that A, didn't exist, and B, if they did, they failed. And on the basis of those mythological and invented mythologies, invented histories, they created the mindset of Zionism towards the Palestinians. And that was necessary, because if you want to get rid of a population of 1.3 million, well, you can't do it through a cocktail party.
Yeah, no half measures.
Exactly. Now, basically, the whole of Jewish history of 3,000 years or so is, on the whole, clean of such genocide or militarism. Yeah. So, the great kingdom of David was basically an invention. The whole of Jewish history had to be reworked. In other words, you had to erase, to remove, to deny, to actually excise 2,000, 3,000 years of history. And because this history was not useful, and it was shameful. It was shameful that Jews did not come to Palestine for 3,000 years when they could have come. Nobody was stopping them. It was shameful that they were not militarized. It was shameful that for Zionism, the Jews did not rise against Hitler. By the way, this is a lie. If you look at histories of the Holocaust and the Second World War, the population that had the highest percentage in fighting as partisans against the Nazis were the Jewish population of Eastern Europe. Who knows this in Israel? Nobody. Of course, every historian knows it and has written it and so on. So I'm very proud that, Jews fought the Nazis in higher numbers than the French, the Belgian, the Italians, etc., the Poles, the Russians. Yeah. This was the highest percentage of population fighting the Nazis. So, the lies go a long way. So basically, they took the partisans part of and kind of accepted them as proper Jews and said, oh, Tzahal, the IDF, is built on their example as well. But they actually denied the rest of the population. They denied the thousands of years of Jewish life. It was very difficult, but also very, very fruitful, very successful until the Holocaust. Jews have arrived at, they got civic rights in most of Europe and were represented in the Polish parliament that was, this is an anti-Semitic country after all. They had enormous representation in the Polish parliament and people had to listen to them. So the idea that Jews were, that the Jewish community lived a shameful life is highly, it's really terrible that this has become the heart of Zionism. It really is destructive. Instead of talking about Jewish life, Zionism is talking about Jewish death. That is the only thing that it is interested in. Jewish life in Iraq, Jewish life in Morocco, Jewish life in Iran. I mean, these were amazing communities. They have contributed to Al-Andalus in Spain. And without the Jewish Muslim culture of Al-Andalus, we wouldn't have the Renaissance.
So, the title of the book is An Army Like No Other, and you emphasise the absolute centrality of the IDF to both the creation of Israel, obviously when the IDF was the Haganah and other paramilitaries, and you mentioned that old line about Prussia being described as not a country with an army, but an army with a country attached to it. Could you explain why you think that description is even more appropriate to Israel and how the military formed a nation wherein, in your view, one didn't really exist before the founding of the Israeli state?
Well, it is not in my view, but in the view of most historians. Now, first of all, Israel and Zionism describe a people called the Jewish people, which is a nation that supposedly existed for 3,000 years. Actually, the concept of the nation and the reality of the nation is a 19th century reality. And, every historian of modern history will make this point. Germany did not exist until the 19th century. Italy did not exist until the 19th century. France existed, but not as a nation until the 19th century. And so if you are talking about the history of nationalism, we're talking about a 19th century modernity-based concept. Now, so that's first thing, is not to fall into this trap of the nation existed 3,000 years ago and the Jews were always a nation. And I think the work of Shlomo Zand and Ben Nun and other historians has given the lie to this. There was no Jewish nation 3,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago, and there was no Jewish nationalism either. Secondly, of course, these people were not a nation, My parents that came from Poland and spoke Yiddish could not speak in any language to Ella Shochat's parents that came from Iraq and Sami Shitrit's parent that came from Morocco. This was not a nation. And it's not me saying it, Ben Gurion said it. He says it again and again. Starting in 1948, he says, we have an army, we now have a country, but we do not have a nation, and we must produce a nation to actually sit here. And he is quite candid about it. He is not pretending. He knows that he has to create a nation because there isn't one. And how do you create a nation? This is a problem that some countries, including Prussia, had faced. And Prussia resolved it through the military. But at least the Prussians didn't have to resort to getting rid of millions of people in order to create their country and their nation. Israel did have to do that. So basically, the foundational act of Israel is the expulsion of the Palestinians. And that could not be done without the IDF. It could not be done without military power. I don't mean just military power. I mean violence on a massive scale, because people don't leave their home and go to another country as refugees unless they're forced. And, my parents didn't leave willingly, and nobody that I know is leaving willingly and going to another country. They are forced by circumstances. So in order to get rid of the Palestinians, and they intended to get rid of all of them, you had to have a military solution. So before there was a nation, there was an army. And that army was democratic as far as Jews were concerned, because all males in 1948, unless they were ill seriously in one way or another, were forced into the army. And not just males, but a lot of the females. So in terms of Jewish people in Israel, the army was the only institution that mattered. It was the only institution that was democratically inclusive. not because they were voting for it democratically, but because everyone was pressed into it. Yeah. So when you look at, if you wanted to have the trade unions as the machinery of turning people there into a nation, it wouldn't work because most people were not members of the trade unions. If you wanted the kibbutz to do it, it wouldn't work because it was 1% of the population. If you wanted, the theater to do it, you had to have an organization that had most people under its control. And that's why the logical choice was the army. But of course, an army is not a university. An army is not a charity. An army is a military force there to destroy other people. And that's what this army did. So part of creating the nation was the education into the settler colonial state, the militarized settler colonial state. It couldn't be otherwise. You couldn't create it any other way. To make sure that this has happened in a total way, the army, as I describe in the book, is actually active in every aspect, every single aspect of public life in Israel. It's the only one that is involved in every single aspect. For example, it is involved in the theater, in the cinema, in music, in radio, in television, in literature, in historical theory, It is involved in all the universities, all the colleges. In the 50s, early when we arrived, the teachers in the camps, the displaced persons camps in Israel, the so-called ma'abarot, the transit camps, the teachers that taught Hebrew were exclusively women soldiers, in arms, in uniform, armed, standing before little children, teaching them Hebrew, teaching them Bible, teaching them. So basically, the first contact of most Israelis with the army was not at 18. It was at 5 or 6, when a young lady came to teach you Hebrew and the alphabet. So this is the kind of foundational basis. Now, for example, most music in the 50s and 60s started in army troops. These were the only groups that actually sang in public, not just in army camps. No, they were very popular. And they sang on the radio, they sang before audiences in theaters in all the cities. They would, and of course, this was the thing holding the nation together. The culture grew up from the army. The army supported, and still does, an enormous publishing empire, very lavishly produced, because that serves. The best known and loved weekly is called B'machaneh, which means in the camp, and this is the one that everyone in Israel reads. So this is what we're talking about. We're not talking about just serving in the army, which everyone did if you were Jewish, but after and before and during the serving in the army, you were actually creating the nation by whatever you did. This is why you can't compare it. Think about the British Army. The British Army is indeed not, a nice organization, but it's really unlike the Israeli army. The American army is basically a neo-colonial army. It's not a nice organization. Just ask the Vietnamese or ask anyone in East Asia. But it's not an army like... it's not an army of the people in the same way that the people became an army. Ben-Gurion coined the expression, the people is the army. Ha'am kulo tzava. The whole nation is the army. Not the people, but the whole nation, so that no one is excluded from this exciting work to create a nation. So if you look at what the army does and how it does it, it is controlling most of the industry. Most of the new technology, most I mean more than 80% of the new technology companies come from directly are run by army officers or ex-officers. I don't know about another country where this is the case.
You talk in the book about what you describe as a military, industrial, academic complex, and the extent to which the health of the Israeli economy is dependent on production of high-tech weaponry, much of it sold abroad, and you describe how the occupied territories have become a sort of testing ground for these weapons, which a French or British arms company doesn't have to the same extent. To your mind, does that basically serve to completely foreclose any kind of peaceful settlement, because there is just no constituency for peace in Israel except right at the margins, because the society has become entirely dependent on conflict for its reproduction?
I think what you're describing is very accurate, yeah. Basically, by making war, conflict, death, destruction, interests, financial, cultural, and existential interests of the population, because the population became a nation by the army. The army created it, monster, and shaped it. Then you can't really have any significant, I mean significant, more than 0.5%. You know, this is the truth. So there isn't more than 0.5% of people that can say the things that I'm saying in Israel. They're not saying them. So and they're not thinking it. And why they're not thinking it? Because they are a creature of the army. Everyone has grown up into this straitjacket. It's not a straitjacket a physical straitjacket, but it is an ideological, an economical, an academic straitjacket, and they have not lived outside it. They have not functioned, and they are not at all of the opinion that you can function outside it. So in order to have a solution, you have to have people who present it and others who read and hear and listen to it and think, well, maybe this can happen, maybe not, but let's see. Now, actually, what Israel has become, because of its particular history, is a war lab. It's the biggest war lab since Vietnam. Now, the testing of this lab is done outside of its boundaries normally. Though now, interestingly, the people demonstrating against Netanyahu are getting the Palestinian treatment. You probably saw this, yeah? The same machinery, the same methods, the same constricting on the neck, etc. Same methods are used, because if you are training dogs, they don't learn new tricks overnight, yeah? So they stick to the tricks they know, which is stepping on the neck. So basically, Israel is surrounded by regions which are war labs. And in those regions, they can do what they like. And it doesn't have to be, in the last few months, Israel is destroying huge part of Iran. You know, everything that you can think of has been touched by this. The ports, the airports, the different military, non-military facilities, the nuclear facilities, etc. So even things which are nothing to do with the military are being destroyed by mysterious forces. Israel is not admitting it, but it's not denying it, because this is the position they're always taking. So it's not that they are limiting themselves to the Arab countries. they would act anywhere and everywhere with total impunity because they are supported by the most by the most powerful forces on earth. So they are not just thinking they have impunity, but they do have impunity. So at the moment, who could actually even think, not march for, not vote for, but even think that Israel can exist without this machinery? Now, what it would mean, let's go into the mindset. What it would mean is giving up everything that they know, everything important that they know, the jobs, the way of thinking, the way of analysis, the way of description, the money that different organizations get, for example, the universities, from the army. In Jerusalem, there is an army base at the heart of the campus. At the heart of the campus, the 1,200 soldiers who sleep there. I mean, they are the only ones sleeping there. Okay, there's a military camp in the heart of the campus of the security services and the army. So, the universities, for example, because I'm an academic, this is an interesting field for me, cannot possibly at all, for a moment, conceive of giving up the support of the army because, it's like losing what they've got.
And they're also dependent on research grants, which are used for military research coming from the United States and the EU as well, right?
Of course, yeah. I mean, Israel is getting per capita more than any other country in the EU. It's not even a member of the EU, but per capita, Israel is getting more money from the EU than the member states. So what are we talking about? To give it all up? I mean, this money from Europe, this money from the EU is money for military research, for security research. It's not for, studying the Hollywood cinema or, some languages spoken in Eastern Asia. This is what the money is for. So in a sense, Israel, to become inclined for a just peace, will have to give up everything. Apartheid will have to be disbanded. The legislation which makes the Arabs not a second and not a third, but third-grade citizens, but non-citizens, will have to be repealed. All the legislation that allows to take land away from Palestinians will have to be repealed. Israel will not exist in the way that it does now if it wanted, proper, just peace. That is the truth. And nobody in Israel now is either proposing it or so the only constituency for what I consider the only democratic solution, and that is a state of its citizens, a democratic secular state of its citizens. This is only supported by the Arab population and less than 0.1% of the Jewish population. What is left out of the people that don't support the attacks on Gaza, some of them support this. That's it. That's what we have.